All right, so now that we have our trigger volume set up and added to our test level, the next step is going to be to actually add the observer pattern or the event setup in the script that handles our trigger volume. So what we're going to do first is follow the format for this that is used in this Unity Learn events tutorial. So if you've never seen this, it's a good idea to give it a watch and see how they do it. And it basically involves creating a delegate and then creating an event and then subscribing to the event and doing the event stuff. So we'll do that first, and then after that I'll show you one way that's a little bit of a shortcut. So here is Visual Studio. I need to open that new script I made. So I'm going to hit Control comma and search for it. Control comma is a pretty useful hotkey in Visual Studio if you've never tried it. So here it is, contextual message trigger. Go ahead and get rid of start and update here. And let's see. So the first step here is going to be to make a delegate for this event that we want to use. So to recap a little bit, we're setting up the observer pattern, and in C#, the observer pattern is using a built-in language feature called events. And so the one pattern for using events is to start with creating a delegate. And you can think of a delegate as sort of a special type that defines basically a variable that can store a function. So you're storing a function so that you can use it later. For example, you could use it when some sort of event happens. So you see delegates a lot, like if you're dealing with like internet code, web code, and you want to have what's called a callback. So you try to do something on the server, and the server will send you back a message when your request either succeeded or failed, and then you may want to react to that some specific way. So you can create a delegate to store whatever action you want to take based on the status of your web request. So in other words, it's good for taking actions kind of asynchronously, like at some later point based on some event. So the syntax for delegate is kind of weird. So we'll just write public because we want other classes to be able to use this delegate if they wanted. And we'll say public delegate because it's a delegate. Void because we're defining a type of method or a type of function that fits in this delegate, which is like a type of variable. So the type of method that's going to fit in this particular delegate is void. It has a void return type. And now we're going to give it a name. So we'll call it contextual message trigger. Actually, contextual message triggered past tense action. And then open close parentheses. So we're kind of defining the signature for the method that will fit in this delegate type that we've created. So just like if you created like a float variable, you can't store strings in it. Well, we're creating a special variable type that can only store void methods with no parameters. So it's important to really think about the names for this stuff to try and make it, as sensible as possible. The reason I call it contextual message triggered action is because this delegate is going to define actions we want to take whenever the message is triggered. It's just so that's the mindset there. We'll get back to it in a minute. But there are some ways you can name events and event handlers and delegates that makes life more sensible. All right, so the next step is going to actually define our event here. So we're going to say public static, so there can only be one of these events in the whole class, which we can talk more about that later. So public static event, and then we're going to give this thing a name, and we're going to call it contextual, contextual message triggered. Now, this is what I want to call my event, but I've left out a step. We have to describe what type of delegate this event will use. So, in other words, what type of method will we call when this event happens? So we define that up here. So we have to explain that while we define the event. So let's go over this again. Public means you can access this outside of this class. Static means there's only one of these events for the whole class. The whole class shares this event as opposed to having different instances of it. Contextual message triggered action is this delegate type that we created up here on line 7, and it's basically describing the signature of a function that would be able to be stored in this event that we made here. So just like you can define a type like this is a type, or float or int is a type, we made a special type here that describes a kind of method that can be stored in this event that we created. I get it that this is kind of convoluted and confusing seeming, but with repetition, it's a little easier. And like I said, I'll show you in a little bit a way to maybe simplify this. So sometimes you see people call the events on contextual message triggered or something like that. I think that's a mistake. You want to name your events basically some action with a past tense. So your event is essentially broadcasting when something has happened. So in this case, it's going to be when the contextual message was triggered. That is key to our naming here. And then when this event occurs, other things will react to it on contextual message triggered. So we'll work on that next. But I guess before we start reacting to this event, it's important that we actually raise the event or invoke the event when it happens. So in Unity, we can tell when something goes into a trigger by using the onTriggerEnter Unity message. You can see Visual Studio Tool, or I forget what this is actually called. Visual Studio Tools for Unity, I think is what it's called. They have some nice stuff built in, like that's why it can auto-complete what it calls a Unity message. And so a Unity message is just the Unity engine will automatically send to our script here a message so that it calls this function at the right time. So that's why it says Unity message there. Same thing with start and update. The Unity, I'm never actually calling these methods myself. The Unity engine is messaging my mono behaviors at the appropriate times so that they call things like onTriggerEnter and update and start, etc. at the correct times. All right, so I know this one will get called whenever something enters the trigger volume. So I guess it's a good idea to make sure that something is the player. So we want to say something like if other, that's this parameter here that gets passed in when this is called, well, maybe we should do like a compare tag, right? Oops, just a sec. So we want to say if other dot compare tag. So we're going to check that game object that touched our trigger and see if it has a specific tag. we want to see if it's the player. And that's going to require that we double check our player character here. The thing that actually has the collider on it is tagged as player. So you want to make sure that you do that before we forget. Now, so if the player enters our trigger, what do we want to do? We want to invoke or raise this message, this event, I mean. So we're going to broadcast out to the world this event happened. So we will say contextual message triggered dot invoke. So this is how we announce that this event happened, which is essentially the way the observer pattern works. You have your observers that listen for the events, and you have your subjects which announce that the events happened. So this is like the subject in our observer pattern context here. So you can read about it here a little bit. So there's the observer that's going to listen for the event, and then there's the subject that's going to announce when the event has occurred. So the issue here is, the way this works is this event, when it's invoked, all of the various functions that have been stored inside of this special variable that holds functions will get called. But if there are no functions stored inside here, it could be null. And so when we try to use something that's null, you could get a null reference exception. And that's something we want to avoid. So what we want to do is check if the contextual message triggered event is not equal to null before we do this thing. And let's just move this up here. So if the event is not null, we will raise the event. Now, what's left out is we need something to actually subscribe to the event. So we've got our subject set up here in the observer pattern. Now we need to create our observer that actually cares when this event has happened. But before we do that, let's go ahead and save our work. So we created our delegate and our event and our onTrigger enter, and we are invoking the event here. What we need to do over here is we set the player tag. We added the player tag to our player game object, so I'll make sure I actually save the scene this time. And then we'll go to GitHub Desktop and we will explain that that's what we've done. So created contextual message triggered event added player tag. All right. And so we can check and see that's actually what's happening. And we will make this commit, and we will work on adding the rest of the observer pattern setup in the next video.